The meeting had been canceled by 3 in the afternoon, and I was already pulling into the driveway before the sun had dropped below the live oaks lining our street in Savannah. I had the rolled blueprint tucked under my arm, the one Brett needed to sign before end of week, the one that would put the studio's name on a contract worth more than anything we had landed in the past 2 years. I didn't text ahead. I never needed to. I came through the side door the way I always did, set my bag on the bench, and heard his voice before I heard anything else. Not loud. Not the voice of a man who thought anyone was listening. Brett was in his office at the end of the hall, door half open, speaking the way people speak when they are completely certain they are alone. I stopped moving. I don't know why. Some part of me already knew to be still. Jess. Just relax. Diana signs whatever I put in front of her. She never reads the fine print. She never has. There was a pause on his end. A short laugh. The kind that sits low in the throat. Once we get 3 big contracts running through the studio name, I walk. Then we start. I was standing in the hallway holding a blueprint he had asked me to rush. My name was on that document in 2 places. The studio my mother and I had built across 11 years. The client relationships my father had handed us with both hands. The reputation I had protected through late nights and early mornings, while Brett told people at dinner parties that he believed in what we were building. I had believed every word of it. I did not walk into that office. I turned around, went back to the kitchen, set the blueprint flat on the counter, and filled a glass of water from the tap. I stood at the sink and drank it slowly, looking out at the backyard, at the garden Brett had suggested we plant last spring and never once touched after the first weekend. My hands were not shaking. That was the part that surprised me most. My hands were completely still. The next 5 days, I gave Brett nothing different. I made coffee in the morning and slid his mug to the same spot on the counter where it had always been. I asked about his week, laughed at the right moments, and sat across from him at dinner with the same face I had worn for 3 years. What changed was only what was happening behind that face. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to see. Brett took his calls in the garage now, not his office. Door pulled shut behind him every time his phone lit up. His laptop screen went dark the moment I walked into the room, a reflex so smooth it had clearly been practiced. I didn't say a word. I just started paying attention the way I pay attention when a client's floor plan doesn't add up and I know something structural is wrong underneath. His calendar was the first thing that told me something real. I saw it by accident on a Tuesday morning. His phone left face up on the kitchen island while he was in the shower. A recurring entry. Every Tuesday and Thursday. Labeled, budget review call. Blocked for 90 minutes. With a contact saved only as Jess. 90 minutes is not a budget call. I know what 90 minutes looks like in a workday. And it is not accounting. That afternoon, I went to the studio alone and pulled up the contract archive on my personal server. Not the shared system Brett had access to, but the one I had maintained separately since the day we opened. 3 major design contracts in the past year. All of them introduced through Brett. All of them executed through the same construction firm on the build-out side. A firm I had never once sat across a table from. I had signed every invoice without asking why the vendor name never changed. I copied the full archive onto an external drive and locked it in my desk drawer at the studio, the one with the key I had never put on Brett's ring. I drove home, started dinner, and when he walked in at 6:15, I asked him how his day went and listened to every word he said. The studio's operating account was the next place I looked, and what I found there was not dramatic. It was quiet and methodical, which made it worse. 4 separate transfers over 8 months, each one between $2,800 and $3,500, each one logged under the category of consulting fees. Sent to an LLC I did not recognize and had never approved. The total came to $12,400. There were no invoices attached. There were no service agreements in any folder I could find. I searched the LLC name through Georgia's business registry that same evening. Sitting alone at my desk after Brett had gone to bed, the registered agent address was a suite in Midtown Atlanta, the kind of address that exists only on paper. The name listed as the LLC's authorized representative was Jessica M. Pruitt. I typed the name into LinkedIn and found her in under 10 seconds. Account manager at Brett's company, based in Atlanta. Profile photo taken at some kind of industry event, with string lights in the background. Hello. Her cover image was a wide shot from a commercial trade show. Spring of last year. The kind of photo where nobody is posing because nobody thinks anyone is looking. Brett was in the right edge of the frame, standing close to a woman I now had a name for, close enough that their arms were touching. Simone Aldridge had shot that event. I remembered because she had complained about the lighting in the main hall and sent me 3 test frames to ask which color grade I preferred. Simone was my closest friend outside the studio, a commercial photographer who had worked alongside me for years. Someone who kept every raw file she had ever taken because she said you never know what a client might come back and need. I called her that night and kept my voice easy, asking if she still had the unedited files from the April show last year. She said she had all of it. She sent me the full folder by midnight. I went through it slowly, frame by frame, and found 14 images where Brett and Jessica were seated together in a side meeting room off the main exhibition floor, not in the general event space, not in a group, but alone at a table with documents spread between them and Brett's laptop open in front of them both. The timestamps ran across 2 separate hours during the event, which was the same event Brett had told me he was attending solo for a vendor walkthrough. I copied everything onto a second external drive and carried it to the studio the following morning, locked it inside the fireproof cabinet behind my drafting table, and sat down at my desk and opened my current project file like it was any other Tuesday. I called Simone from my cell, not the studio line, keeping it short. I need to see you. Not about work. Something else. She didn't ask questions. She just said she would come to me. Damon Pruitt's office was on the 3rd floor of a building 2 blocks from Forsyth Park. Small waiting room. No receptionist at the front desk when I arrived. Just a woman behind frosted glass who nodded when I gave my name. Simone had connected me to him through someone outside my family's circle, which was exactly what I needed. I sat across from him with both external drives on the table between us and let him go through everything without interrupting. He looked up after a few minutes and asked if the prenuptial agreement had a conflict of interest clause covering business activity. I told him I had drafted that language myself. He set the drive down and said, "Then this is exactly what that clause was written for." He walked me through what he could file in Chatham County Superior Court and how quickly he could move for an emergency asset freeze once the petition was submitted. Under Georgia law, when one spouse uses jointly held assets or shared business reputation to benefit a third party without the other spouse's knowledge or consent, that constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty within the marriage. The LLC transfers, the contract referrals, the email trail Brett had created by forwarding studio documents to Jessica's personal account. All of it pointed in the same direction. Damon said he could be ready in 2 weeks. I told him to start. I drove home that afternoon and made dinner. Brett came in at his usual time, loosened his tie at the kitchen doorway the way he always did, and asked what smelled good. I told him it was the chicken he liked and handed him a glass of water. Nothing in my face gave him anything to read. The only thing I changed was the paperwork. Every document Brett brought to me in the days that followed, I told him I needed to loop in the studio's accountant before signing, that I wanted to make sure everything was categorized correctly for year-end. He accepted that the first time, and the second, and by the third time there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before. A small tightness, a question he didn't know how to ask. That weekend he suggested we drive out to Tybee Island, just the 2 of us, out of nowhere on a Saturday morning while I was reading at the kitchen table. No occasion. No reason attached. I think we need a reset. Just us. I looked up and smiled and said that sounded nice. While he was in the other room booking the hotel, I stepped outside and called my mother. Mom, I need you to stay quiet for 2 more weeks. You'll understand everything when it's done. Carol didn't push. She asked only if I was certain, and I told her I had been certain since the week before. Then I called my father. I didn't give Raymond details, just one sentence. Delivered the same way he had always taught me to deliver anything that mattered. Dad. Don't refer any new projects through Brett. He didn't ask why. He said understood, and the call was over in under a minute. It was a Sunday night, 2 weeks after I had sat across from Damon and told him to start. Brett came home later than usual, jacket still on when he walked through the door, and I could see from across the room that something had already reached him before I did. His company's compliance team had sent an internal notice that afternoon regarding a conflict of interest review tied to several outside contracts. He didn't know yet how far the thread had been pulled. He set his keys down and looked at me, the way people look when they are trying to read a room they no longer recognize. I had set 2 glasses of wine on the table. Not a special occasion, just 2 glasses, the way I used to do on quiet Sunday nights before I knew what I knew. I sat down first and waited. Rough day, he said, pulling out the chair across from me, and I could hear him working to keep his voice at its normal register. Company's dealing with some internal stuff. Nothing major. I nodded and let a beat pass before I said, Is it the Jessica Pruitt situation? The glass in his hand stopped moving. Where did you hear that name? The question came out slower than he intended. Each word placed carefully. And that carefulness told me everything about how unprepared he was for this moment. I kept my voice even and said I heard it from 14 raw photo files. From $12,400 in consulting transfers to an LLC with no invoices, and from his own voice in his own office 3 weeks ago when he was certain I wasn't home. Brett pushed back from the table and stood up, hands moving like he was looking for something to hold on to, and said he could explain. That things had gotten complicated. That he had been under enormous pressure and had made decisions he wasn't proud of, but that none of it changed how he felt about us. I looked at him for a long moment and said, Damon Pruitt already has everything you'd want to explain. He's been waiting 2 weeks. The sound Brett made was not a word. It was the sound of a man who had built a careful structure and just heard the foundation go. He sat back down slowly, both hands flat on the table, and I watched the version of him I had believed in for 3 years stop pretending it had ever been real. I leaned forward slightly and kept my voice at the same level it had been all evening. You came to me for the studio name, for my father's network, for my signature on contracts you arranged with Jessica before the ink was dry on our marriage license. You calculated everything correctly except one thing. I let that sit for exactly 1 breath. I read everything. I always have. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, the one I had set there before he arrived home, and walked to the front door without rushing. Brett did not follow. He didn't call after me. He sat at that table in the house we had shared and said nothing, because there was nothing left that the plan had prepared him to say. That night I slept on the couch in my studio, windows open to the Savannah air, and it was the first night in 3 years that the silence around me felt like something I had chosen. Damon filed the divorce petition at Chatham County Superior Court on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday the emergency motion for asset freeze had been granted. The joint accounts were locked before Brett had finished his first meeting of the day. Heltway's access credentials to the studio's financial system were revoked the same afternoon, quietly, without a system notification, because I had asked our account administrator to process it as a routine security update. The compliance review at Brett's company completed its preliminary findings within the same week. The investigators had pulled his work email and found forwarded threads containing studio contract documents, vendor pricing, and client correspondence. all sent from his company account to a personal address outside the organization's server. That was a clean NDA violation, documented and time-stamped. And it required no interpretation. Brett was placed on paid administrative leave pending a final decision, which in that industry means the decision has already been made. Jessica Pruitt's termination came through the same compliance process. Once the LLC registration tied her directly to the $12,400 in transfers from the studio's operating account. The conflict of interest finding was straightforward. The company she and Brett had planned to launch using those funds and those connections never filed a registration. The plan dissolved before it had a name. I met with Damon one more time after the freeze order came through, and he walked me through where things stood. The prenuptial agreement held on every clause that mattered. The studio's intellectual property, its client contracts, its trade name, and my mother Carol's 30% stake were all outside Brett's reach. Damon said, "He leaves with what he brought in." And I asked him to be specific. And he said, "Not much." I signed the final settlement documents in his office without Brett present, which was how I had asked for it to be arranged. Raymond made one call. Not to a lawyer, not to a journalist, just to the network of contractors and project managers he had built across Georgia over 4 decades. A single sentence delivered the same way he delivered everything that was final. Brett Callum is no longer connected to this family. In that industry. In this state. One sentence from Raymond Callum closes every door that matters. And it closes them without noise. Brett signed the divorce agreement through his own attorney and was out of the house before the week ended. I was not there when he left. I was having dinner with Simone at a restaurant on River Street, and when she asked if I was okay, I told her I had been okay for longer than Brett realized. 2 weeks after the settlement was signed, I reclaimed the one room in the studio that Brett had used as his own. It had been the corner office off the main drafting space, the room with the best light in the building, the one I had always intended for client presentations before Brett decided it suited him better for his private calls. I had the furniture cleared out in a single afternoon and repainted the walls in a blue-gray that Brett had once described as cold and unwelcoming. Standing in that room with fresh paint drying and afternoon light coming through the tall windows, I thought it was the most beautiful color I had ever chosen. The largest contract in the studio's history came through the following month. A commercial exhibition project out of Atlanta with an international component, sourced entirely through a client relationship I had built before Brett and maintained without him. No referral from his network. No introduction through his contacts. Just 11 years of work showing up exactly when it was supposed to. Simone sent me a message the morning the contract was signed. Just 4 words. "You doing okay over there?" I wrote back that I was doing better than okay. And I meant it in a way I had not been able to mean anything for a long time. Carol came to the studio on the first Monday after everything had settled. And she did not bring flowers or words prepared in advance. She brought 2 cups of coffee from the place on Whitaker Street that I had loved since I was in my 20s. Set one on my desk without ceremony. Pulled a chair to the drafting table. And opened her laptop. We worked side by side for 4 hours and neither of us said anything about Brett or about the months just behind us. That was the moment I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized I was still holding. I cried that afternoon. Not because of what had been taken, but because of what had never left. My mother had been there the whole time. My father had needed only one sentence to act. Simone had kept 14 photographs in a folder she had never thought to delete. The people who actually belonged in my life had stayed exactly where they were, and I had been the one looking in the wrong direction. Brett had wanted access to something he thought he could take. The studio's name, the family's reach, the credibility that 2 generations had built without him. What he never understood was that none of it was transferable. It was not in the contracts or the accounts or the referral lists. It was in the room where Carol and I sat working that Monday afternoon, in the coffee that tasted the same as it always had, in the drafting table that had been in this space since before Brett knew my name. He had held the key for 3 years and never once understood what the door actually led to. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. There is a little of my own life in Diana, in the way she learned that the people who were always meant to be there never actually left. If something here stayed with you, leave a comment below. I read every single one.